Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a tempestuous evening in late autumn when the great mystery of the old lighthouse first presented itself to us. The wind howled through the streets of London, lashing against the windows of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, and the rain beat relentlessly upon the roof. The gaslight flickered weakly in the corner, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and I sat by the fire, my thoughts drifting as I watched the flames dance. Sherlock Holmes, who had been lounging in his armchair in his usual detached manner, seemed more restless than usual that evening. His keen eyes, typically so sharp, appeared clouded by a sense of ennui, and his long fingers drummed ceaselessly on the armrest, as if in search of a distraction. He had long been craving a case worthy of his intellect, and though our life in London was never without mystery, it had been some time since anything had truly stirred him. "I do find it rather tedious, Watson," he remarked, without looking at me, his voice tinged with frustration. "The trifling cases I have received of late have been nothing more than exercises in deduction. I crave something more, something with depth, a challenge." I nodded, understanding his sentiment well. We both knew that Holmes could not bear the monotony of solving petty thefts and trivial disputes. What he sought, as always, was the intricate, the complex, the seemingly unsolvable. Little did I know that very evening would change all that, and in a most unexpected manner. A sudden knock at the door broke the silence, followed by the sharp voice of our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, calling, "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes." Moments later, a figure appeared at the threshold of our room. A woman, pale and trembling, her face drawn with the weight of some deep and unspoken terror. She was clad in a heavy coat of dark fabric, and her eyes, wide with fear, darted about the room as though she were unsure whether to approach or flee. "Mr. Holmes," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" I rose to my feet, my curiosity piqued by the woman's distressed state. "Indeed, madam," I replied courteously, "and you are welcome to join us. Please make yourself comfortable." The woman, whose appearance suggested a life of genteel employment, hesitated before stepping fully into the room. She seemed to gather her thoughts before speaking again, as though each word carried some terrible weight. "I am Miss Clara Penrose," she began, her voice shaky. "A governess from the Cornish coast. She paused, clearly struggling to control her emotions. "I come with a tale of great mystery and dread, one that concerns the death of a man in a place where no one should die, and where no one should go. I beg of you, Mr. Holmes. My father, my employer, and I all have reason to fear what happened there." She hesitated again before continuing, her face paling further. "It is the lighthouse, Blackridge Lighthouse." Holmes, who had been quiet until now, raised his eyes sharply from the chemistry set before him, his entire demeanour shifting. "The lighthouse," he repeated, his voice now imbued with the unmistakable tone of interest. "Go on, Miss Penrose. You have our full attention." Miss Penrose's hands trembled as she spoke, her voice low and filled with an unsettling urgency. "The keeper of Blackridge Lighthouse, Elias Grimshaw," she began, "was found dead under strange circumstances. His neck was broken, and his body was discovered at the base of the lighthouse's spiral staircase. His face. She shuddered visibly, her eyes fluttering as though the very memory of the scene haunted her. His face was frozen in terror, Mr. Holmes, as though something unimaginable had gripped his soul in his final moments. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, whose expression had grown serious. "What time did this occur?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, but full of that familiar razor-sharp precision. "It happened 3 days ago, on a night that was strangely calm, despite the usual storms that batter the coast. The light on the tower was flickering that night, though the keeper had assured us just days before that the mechanism was functioning perfectly." Holmes leaned forward, his hands steepled together in his characteristic pose. "Flickering, you say? And this despite no mechanical fault?" Miss Penrose nodded. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. That was one of the most unsettling things. The light should have burned brightly throughout the night, but the villagers spoke of it flickering as though it were signalling something or someone. And yet," I remarked, "it was not considered suspicious by the authorities." "Not until I arrived, Doctor," Miss Penrose replied with a tight smile. "The police insisted it was a mere accident, that Grimshaw had perhaps lost his footing in the dark. But I believe there is more to this than meets the eye." Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently against his lips. "Tell me more," he said, his eyes never leaving Miss Penrose's face. "What else did you observe?" "Something that still baffles me to this moment," she replied softly. "A strange symbol, carved into the wooden panel near the lamp room. It was a serpent, twisted in a circle. It looked ancient, as though it had been etched there long before Grimshaw's time. And yet, when I questioned the other keepers, none of them had seen it before." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "A symbol, you say? A clue, perhaps? This is no simple death, Miss Penrose. I believe you are correct. There is more here than we have been led to believe." There was a brief silence in the room after Miss Penrose uttered the word serpent. Holmes, who had remained seated with eyes half closed for most of her account, now sat upright, as though an electric current had passed through him. A gleam, sharp and unmistakable, had entered his gaze, and his long fingers steepled together in front of his chin. "A serpent twisted in a circle," he murmured. "Ouroboros, perhaps. An ancient symbol of eternity and secrecy. Curious, Watson, extremely curious." Miss Penrose looked from Holmes to me and back again. "Does it mean anything to you, Mr. Holmes?" "Only that we are dealing with something far older and more elaborate than a mere accident," he replied. "You mentioned Grimshaw appeared increasingly fearful in the days before his death. Did he confide in anyone?" "Only in part," she said. "He grew isolated, nervous. He barely spoke. But on the day before his death, I saw him writing feverishly in a small leather-bound book. When I asked after his health, he looked up, startled, and said, 'There are some lights, Miss Penrose, that should never shine again.' That was the last conversation I had with him." Holmes nodded slowly, absorbing every word. This Grimshaw was no fool, then. He sensed something he believed was beyond explanation. And that symbol, scratched near the lamp room, it was not placed there carelessly. It was meant as a message. He stood, retrieving his violin from the mantel, though he did not raise it to play. "Watson, pack for travel. We leave for Cornwall at first light." I looked at him, startled. "You believe this worth investigating?" Holmes turned to me, his expression alight with rare intensity. "My dear Watson, we are not merely dealing with a suspicious death. We are standing at the edge of a forgotten world, ritual, fear, and perhaps a design far more deliberate than any have dared imagine. And with that, the case had begun. It was still dark when we departed Paddington by the early express to the West Country, our compartments rattling westward under a shroud of slate-coloured clouds. Holmes, as was his habit when engaged upon a case that piqued his intellectual appetite, spent much of the journey in contemplative silence, his eyes half-lidded, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin. I, on the other hand, pored over the notes I had made from Miss Penrose's account, occasionally glancing at my companion in hopes of some early deduction, but he offered nothing beyond the occasional furrowing of his brow. As we approached Cornwall, the land grew more rugged and elemental. Jagged cliffs broke the horizon, and the sea, roiling and grey beneath a low sky, beat mercilessly upon the rocks. There was a stark beauty in the desolation of that coast, a kind of ancient brooding silence that seemed to speak of long-forgotten secrets. By late afternoon, we arrived in the coastal village of Saint-Trévent, a place scarcely more than a cluster of stone cottages huddled against the wind. The villagers, wary-eyed and close-lipped, eyed us with a guarded curiosity, and we soon found lodgings at a modest inn whose proprietor spoke in hushed tones of the light on the headland. Holmes scarcely paused to rest before requesting directions to the lighthouse. "We begin at once, Watson," he said. "Time has already stolen 3 days from us. If this place holds secrets, it is our task to draw them into the light." And so it was that we first beheld Blackridge Lighthouse, rising like a solitary sentinel above the battered cliffs, an edifice not only of stone, but of silence, shadow, and something far more inscrutable. We were met at the base of the lighthouse by a man of middle years, clad in a coarse oilskin coat, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that never quite met our own. He introduced himself in a clipped Cornish accent as Mr. Braden, the assistant keeper who had worked alongside the late Elias Grimshaw for several years. Holmes introduced us with polite formality, but his eyes were already examining Braden's posture, the tension in his jaw, the way his left hand clenched just a second too long when speaking Grimshaw's name. "I imagine this must be a difficult time," I offered, attempting a tone of reassurance. Braden gave a stiff nod. Grimshaw was a quiet man, kept to himself, but he did his duty well enough. "A hard thing. What happened?" "You were the one to find him," Holmes inquired, his tone neutral. Braden's eyes flickered. "Aye. I came up in the morning to relieve him, and there he was, at the bottom of the stairwell, neck twisted something awful. I called the constable, same as anyone would." "Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to his death?" Braden shifted his weight. "He'd been restless, I'll grant you. Spoke less than usual. Looked like he hadn't been sleeping. But there's little to be done about that. Up here, the wind gets in a man's bones after a while." Holmes nodded slowly, though I could see the glint in his eye. "And what of the symbol carved into the wood near the lamp room?" Holmes asked abruptly. For the first time, Braden's composure faltered. His mouth opened slightly, and he looked between us before replying, "Didn't see no symbol." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "I was given to understand it was rather pronounced." Braden said nothing more, and after a pause, Holmes turned to me. "Let us proceed inside, Watson. I should like to see Grimshaw's quarters." Braden hesitated, then stepped aside, unlocking the heavy door with a rusted key. As we passed him, I could feel the weight of his silence pressing down, as though it carried truths too dangerous to speak aloud. The interior of the lighthouse was narrow and damp, the walls lined with flaking paint and the tang of salt air. We climbed the tight, spiralling staircase until we reached a landing where a modest door opened into Grimshaw's quarters. Braden remained below, offering no further assistance nor invitation to linger. The room was small but meticulously arranged. A modest bunk, a writing desk, and a battered trunk were the only furnishings of note, yet the atmosphere within was weighted with something unspoken. Holmes moved about with noiseless precision, his eyes catching upon every minor detail as I stood near the desk, thumbing through a stack of papers. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, holding aloft a leather-bound volume with worn corners. "The journal Miss Penrose mentioned, and here, pages torn, likely the last entries." He passed me the book. Its earlier passages were mundane, logbook entries, maintenance notations, but near the end, the handwriting changed. It grew erratic, the lines uneven. One fragment read, "They come not for the light, but through it. The signal is the key." Holmes, meanwhile, had pried open the drawer in the desk. "Locked," he murmured, "but not well." He extracted a small case, wrapped in oilcloth, and unfastened it, revealing several small brass tokens, each engraved with the same serpent-like emblem Miss Penrose had described. "Fascinating," Holmes said. "These are not mere decoration. Look at the wear. Handled often, passed from hand to hand. They are tokens of membership, I would wager, though of what order we do not yet know." On the shelf above the desk sat two books, Rites of the Sea Kings and the Tides of Folklore, maritime legends of the Southwest. Holmes leafed briefly through one. "It seems Grimshaw's isolation was not spent in idleness," he remarked. "He was studying something older than the lighthouse itself." I shivered, though the air was not cold. "You believe he feared what he had uncovered?" Holmes' reply was soft. "I believe he feared what he remembered." He replaced the journal in his pocket. "Come, Watson, there is more to be found in the tower, and I suspect in those who remain silent." Shortly after our examination of Grimshaw's quarters, we were visited at the lighthouse by the local constable, a tall and broad-shouldered man with ruddy cheeks, a thick moustache, and the blunt self-assurance of a man used to dealing with drunkards and sheep-thieves rather than matters of subtlety. He introduced himself curtly as Inspector Venn. "I hear you've come down from London, Mr. Holmes," he said, sizing my companion with a certain defensive air. "Scotland Yard sent for you, did they?" "No," Holmes replied mildly. "I was called here by Miss Penrose." "Ah," Venn grunted. "The governess? Good lady, but she reads too many Gothic novels if you ask me. Sees ghosts in the fog." Holmes offered a thin smile. "And what is your own conclusion regarding Grimshaw's death?" "Tragic accident," Venn said flatly. "The man was peculiar. Always had his nose in odd books, muttering to himself. Lately, he'd been claiming he saw lights out to sea. Likely had a fall while sleepwalking or in some sort of daze. We've had no signs of foul play. No footprints, no forced entry. The case is closed." "Is that so?" Holmes asked, gently brushing imaginary dust from his cuff. "And the serpent symbol carved in the lamp room?" Venn frowned. "Superstitious nonsense. Probably there for years. You'll find all sorts of old scratches in buildings like this. I wouldn't waste your time chasing after phantoms, Mr. Holmes." I saw Holmes's eyes narrow slightly, though his tone remained pleasant. "Inspector, it is precisely such phantoms that most often leave footprints, if one knows where to look." Venn snorted. "Well, look all you like, but don't expect us to reopen any cases based on fairy tales." And with that, The inspector turned on his heel and left, boots clanging on the iron steps. Holmes watched him go with amusement, then turned to me. "Watson, I believe we ought to visit the stairs next. The inspector is quite right about one thing. People leave signs, even when they think themselves invisible." The winding stairway of the lighthouse was narrow and steep, its iron steps worn smooth by decades of use. Holmes ascended with the lightness of a cat, pausing every few paces to examine some feature of the structure, while I followed more cautiously behind. "Note the fourth rung from the top," he said, crouching low. Slightly loosened at the bolts, enough to tilt under weight, not enough to give way entirely. A man descending in the dark might easily stumble. "Then the inspector's theory may have some merit?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "It would seem plausible, if not for what lies just ahead." He reached the uppermost landing and tapped the interior wall with his cane. "Here, feel along this panel." I ran my fingers over the stone. "A shallow indentation," I said, "like the edge of a boot scraped it." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "Not a slip, but a bracing. Someone stood here, quite deliberately, perhaps to wait, perhaps to strike." He rose and gazed down the spiral well of the staircase. "This is no random fall, Watson. The very architecture betrays intention. The scuff mark is positioned at shoulder height when standing upon the stair, a height suitable for a man raising his arm." He turned sharply. "And yet, our late keeper bore no defensive wounds. That tells us two things. First, the attacker was known to him, or at least not expected to do harm. And second, the strike was swift, a push, well-timed, executed in silence." "And the flickering of the light?" I asked. "Quite possibly manipulated to create a moment of obscurity, an ideal cover for the act." I stared down the narrow stairwell, now somehow darker than before, a murder in plain sight, hidden by shadow and routine. "Indeed," Holmes said. "Let us now return outside. The interior has offered us one truth. I suspect the coastline may yield another." Later that day, while Holmes requested solitude to review his notes and examine the peculiar brass tokens we had recovered, I made my way back into the village of St. Trevon, seeking conversation among those whose lives unfolded beneath the perpetual gaze of the lighthouse. As a former military surgeon and companion to Holmes, I had learned over the years that valuable truths were often spoken not in courtrooms or drawing rooms, but beside hearths and alehouses, where the tongue grew looser and fear took voice. I entered a modest public house near the harbour, a squat building of dark stone and creaking beams, where fishermen and labourers gathered to escape the damp chill of the coast. I ordered a modest drink, and soon found myself in conversation with an elderly man named Rigg, who claimed to have worked the shoreline since his boyhood. "You come with that tall gentleman," he said, eyeing me over his mug. "The one with eyes like knives." "Mr. Holmes is my colleague," I replied. "We're making inquiries about Elias Grimshaw." At the mention of the name, a hush fell over the corner of the room where I sat. Rigg exchanged glances with the man beside him before leaning closer. "They say he saw the lantern men," he said in a hushed tone. "Lantern men?" I asked, though the term was vaguely familiar. "Aye," he nodded. "Old stories, tales the sea tells after dark. Spirits with lanterns, walking the coast at night, luring sailors to the rocks. Some say they're the souls of wreckers, damned to walk the cliffs forever. Others say they're real enough men, hiding in the fog with lights to confuse passing ships." I raised my brow. "Smugglers?" Rigg nodded gravely. "Could be. But there's more to it. Some folk swear they have seen lights dancing across the sea, where no man could walk. Grimshaw, he spoke of such things. Said the light from the tower had been mirrored, answered. Said he feared what walked beyond the mist. I pressed further, asking whether any unusual activity had been seen in recent weeks. But most answers were evasive, glances exchanged, muttered dismissals. One woman, pale and pinched with age, spoke of a boy gone missing last winter near the cove beneath the cliffs. They said he drowned, she whispered, but the tides never gave him back. When I returned to the inn at dusk, Holmes was waiting in the parlour with his violin balanced across his knee. Without looking up, he asked, "Well, Watson, did you find them?" "Find what?" "The stories," he said. "The ones people never tell the constable, but will murmur over cider and creaking chairs." I sat opposite him and recounted all I had heard. The tales of the lantern men, the missing boy, the suggestion that the lighthouse beam was being mirrored. He listened in silence, then finally lowered his violin. The human mind often cloaks its fears in folklore, but beneath the superstition there is often substance. The idea of false lights luring ships to disaster is not new. It is as old as smuggling itself. The symbol we found, the flickering lamp, Grimshaw's dread, it all suggests a signal system, Watson. A beacon not of safety, but of treachery. He rose and moved to the window, gazing toward the sea, now hidden behind a veil of early fog. "I believe we are dealing not with phantoms," he said quietly, "but with men who use the fear of phantoms to conceal their crimes." And with that, the final traces of romantic fancy vanished from the case. The mystery had sharpened, and the trap, though not yet set, had begun to take shape in Holmes's formidable mind. It was late the following morning when Holmes summoned me from the inn's modest breakfast room to join him once more at the Lighthouse. He had risen early, he explained, and had spent the better part of the dawn combing through Grimshaw's effects with a meticulousness that only he could have maintained for such an extended period without succumbing to tedium. When I arrived, he stood at the foot of the tower, a small bundle of notes in his gloved hand, and an unmistakable gleam of discovery in his eyes. "Watson," he said without preamble, Grimshaw was not merely a man troubled by visions or superstitions. He was a man who had uncovered something, a system hidden in plain sight. I followed him inside, where he laid out several weather-stained documents across the desk in Grimshaw's quarters. "These are ledgers," he explained, "but not of lighthouse operation. They are records of shoreline activity, ships sighted, weather patterns, specific flashes of the beacon. Most notably, they reference dates on which the light was reported to behave abnormally." He tapped one entry with his finger. "Here. March 18th. 2 long, 1 short, confirmed reply from Black Gull's Cove. Do you note it?" I did, though its meaning eluded me. Grimshaw was tracking signals, Watson. Light signals. He had discovered an old smuggling route, one I suspect was believed dormant for years, but which under the cover of mist and myth has been resurrected. I stared at the notes, the scale of the implication dawning upon me. "Then you believe he was murdered because he threatened to expose it?" Holmes inclined his head. "I believe he knew too much and signalled his intent to act. And when he did, those with reason to fear him struck first." He paused, gathering the papers. "Come. There is 1 page missing from this set, 1 torn from the journal. I dare say it may contain the moment where discovery met decision." We did not have long to wait. Holmes had observed that one section of Grimshaw's journal, though torn, left behind the faint impression of ink upon the adjacent page. With a small phial of reagents and a sheet of translucent paper, he performed a delicate process I had seen him employ but twice before, rendering the ghost of the writing visible once more. When at last the letters began to reveal themselves, Holmes read in a low voice, "If the moon is high and they answer still, then it is not chance but ceremony. I will not remain silent. Let it end before the 23rd, or I go to London." He paused, then translated what appeared to be a cipher written below in a staggered hand. "Meeting confirmed. Full moon. Watch for 2 short, 3 long, 1 short. Entry at low tide. Beware the serpent's wake." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "The serpent's wake," I repeated. "That was written also on one of the brass tokens." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, a name, I believe, Watson. Not of a vessel, but of a group. Possibly a clandestine society or syndicate cloaked in old maritime legend. The full moon mentioned aligns with the night of Grimshaw's death. That code, 2 short, 3 long, 1 short, is almost certainly a light pattern, perhaps a signal used to guide vessels to an unmarked inlet. Then Grimshaw intended to intercept or expose this meeting, I asked. More likely, he threatened to do so, and paid for it with his life, Holmes replied. This note is not the writing of a man succumbing to madness. It is the record of a man who had seen through the fog of superstition to something far more calculated and dangerous. Holmes folded the page carefully and slipped it into his notebook. Come, Watson. There is a man in this village who knows the shoreline better than most, and I believe it is time we paid him a quiet visit. Holmes had acquired the name through the most subtle of inquiries, a process he often described as the art of listening where others are merely hearing. Tobias Carrick was a local fisherman, a man who kept odd hours and, according to more than one whisper at the inn, was no stranger to unregistered cargo. Holmes suspected that Carrick was not only aware of the clandestine activities along the coast, but was actively complicit in them. Shortly before dusk, we positioned ourselves upon a ridge above the harbour with an unbroken view of the docks. From our vantage, we could see Carrick moving about his small craft, a low-slung cutter with peeling paint and dark sails. He checked the moorings, loaded something wrapped in burlap into the stern, then rowed out into the deeper water under cover of the gathering mist. Holmes watched him through a small collapsible lens. "He is not fishing," he muttered. "That bundle contains no net or line. Note the lantern affixed to the bow, Watson. It is shuttered. The man intends to send a signal." But to whom? Holmes did not answer. We followed on foot along the coastal path, watching as Carrick's boat came to a halt just beyond the outer breakers. He lit the lantern briefly, then dark again. 2 flashes, then 3, then 1. The same pattern we had read in Grimshaw's journal. Suddenly Holmes froze. He is not alone. From a small inlet farther down the coast, a distant glow answered, just once, then vanished. We turned to descend, intending to circle round and intercept Carrick upon his return. But as we reached the dock once more, his boat had drifted back on the tide, swaying gently at the mooring. "Carrick," Holmes called. There was no answer. We found him slumped over the tiller, face frozen in a ghastly rictus, eyes wide with terror. Holmes pressed 2 fingers to the neck. "No pulse," he said grimly. "He's been dead perhaps an hour." "But how? There are no wounds," I said. Holmes examined the mouth, the hands. "Sea water in the lungs," he said, "and yet he never left his boat." He straightened, eyes distant. "We are no longer merely chasing whispers, Watson. We are chasing murder. Carrick's death, baffling, silent, and utterly without warning, cast a new pall over the case." That night, Holmes slept little. By first light, we returned once more to the lighthouse, Holmes now fully convinced that Grimshaw's demise was not the result of chance nor misstep, but part of a sequence, a design wrought by hands both cunning and cruel. While I descended into the cellar in search of the building's original architectural plans, Holmes undertook a fresh examination of the tower itself, retracing the path that Grimshaw would have taken on the night of his death. It was he who called me up the stair shortly after. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing to the floor near the base of the stairs. "Muddy impressions, faint but distinct. Here, and again here. And yet Inspector Venn's report claimed the tower had been locked and undisturbed." I knelt beside them. "They lead into the tower," I said slowly, "and up the stairs." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And note the depth of the tread. This is not the step of a man descending to his end. This is someone ascending, after Grimshaw's time of death. You're certain of the timing?" He gave a slight nod. "Carrick's body confirms the pattern. We are dealing with individuals who move under cover of fog and folklore, but they leave traces nonetheless. Whoever entered here that night did so to remove or to place something, and did so believing they would never be questioned." I paused. "And what of the missing rung? Could it not still have been an accident?" Holmes touched the iron step gently. "Had this been the cause, we would expect injury to the shin or knee. Yet Grimshaw suffered only a broken neck, consistent with a sudden fall or a deliberate push. And with Carrick dead," Holmes cut in, "we must move quickly. Whoever is behind this has begun to tidy the edges of their web. Grimshaw was the first loose end. Carrick the second. I do not intend to let a third slip through." He turned toward the door. "We must speak to Miss Penrose again. She may know more than she realizes." We found Miss Clara Penrose in the garden behind her employer's cottage, her hands folded nervously in her lap and her gaze fixed upon the grey horizon beyond the hedgerow. Holmes, ever gentle in the presence of distress, spoke with a rare softness. "Miss Penrose," he said, "you mentioned, when first we met, that Grimshaw had appeared afraid, that he had said little in his final days. And yet, was there not something more? Something you may have held back, perhaps believing it to be inconsequential or too strange to repeat?" She hesitated, her brow furrowed. Yes, Mr. Holmes. There is something I did not speak of. I cannot say why. It seemed overheard, and thus not mine to share. But now..." She drew a slow breath. "It was the evening before Mr. Grimshaw died. I had gone to the tower to deliver a letter meant for the post, and as I reached the foot of the steps, I heard voices raised in argument, his and Mr. Braden's." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "What did they say?" "I could not make out every word, but Braden's voice was angry, urgent. He said, 'You'll bring the whole circle down,' and then, 'You swore an oath, Elias. Don't be a fool.' Grimshaw replied something about enough blood already, and that he would not be party to it any longer. And then, silence. I left before they could see me." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to me. "Watson, it seems our Mr. Braden has been more than a reticent witness. He is a participant, and perhaps more than that." Miss Penrose's eyes searched our faces. "What does it mean?" Holmes replied gravely, "It means Mr. Braden is not merely hiding the truth. He is attempting to contain it, and he is failing." He rose, eyes now alight with purpose. "Thank you, Miss Penrose. You may well have just saved another life, but now we must act quickly. I believe the serpent is ready to strike again." We found Braden near the tool shed behind the lighthouse, bent low over a crate he appeared to be securing. Holmes approached him swiftly, with all the quiet assurance of a man who had already solved half the riddle. "Mr. Braden," he said, "you have been party to something far older than your post and far darker than the sea beneath us." Braden turned sharply, his face pale, his mouth tight with restraint. "I don't know what you mean." Holmes stepped closer. "You do. You argued with Grimshaw. You spoke of a circle. And now Carrick is dead. I advise you speak now, before silence becomes your own noose." For a moment, Braden froze. Then, without warning, he bolted across the grounds and vanished behind the outer wall of the lighthouse. Holmes made no move to chase him. "Why let him go?" I asked, astonished. "Because a man who runs," Holmes said, eyes narrowing, "will lead us precisely where we need to go. We now know what Grimshaw saw. Soon we shall see who wished it hidden, and why." We returned to our lodgings that evening, with the shadows lengthening across the moor and the air heavy with salt and storm. Holmes said little on the walk back from the lighthouse, his features taut with thought, his gaze fixed upon some invisible plain that stretched far beyond the grey sea and the scattered stones beneath our feet. The events of the day had brought the mystery into sharper relief, yet with each revelation, the danger had also grown nearer. It was shortly after we had settled into our respective rooms that a knock came at the door, no more than a whisper of a sound, a soft tap-tap that might have been missed by any less sensitive ear. I opened it at once, but the corridor stood empty. At my feet, however, lay a folded scrap of paper, aged and slightly curled with moisture. "Holmes," I called. He appeared at once, already fastening his dressing gown, and took the paper from my hand. He examined it for several seconds without unfolding it, then passed it beneath the lamp. At last, he read it aloud. "Leave while the sea still sleeps. Before the fog comes down. The light no longer protects. You were warned. The circle." There was silence between us. Even Holmes, for a moment, seemed to weigh the meaning of the message not only by its words, but by the hand that had chosen to deliver them. "Well," I said at length, "someone wishes us gone." "Indeed," he replied, with the faintest trace of amusement. "The tone is rather theatrical, is it not? But it tells us 3 important things." He held up a finger. "First, that we have struck close enough to rouse fear. Another. Second, that the group responsible styles itself as the Circle, which aligns with Miss Penrose's testimony and the emblem upon the brass tokens." "And the third?" I asked. He looked out the window, where a dense mist had begun to seep across the fields. "That they intend to act under cover of fog, which, if the pattern holds, will arrive with the tide. We must prepare ourselves, Watson." "For what?" "For visitors, unwelcome ones." I sat down heavily. "And the part that said, 'The light no longer protects,' what do you make of that?" Holmes smiled grimly. "It means, my dear Watson, that we have stripped away their mask. The lighthouse was once their refuge. Now it is merely a stage." And with that, Part 3 of the investigation drew to its breathless close, not with a resolution, but with the chill of something terrible about to begin. The ominous warning we had received did nothing to dissuade Holmes from his course. On the contrary, it appeared to strengthen his resolve, for by the following morning he had already drawn up the foundations of what he called a counter-signal operation, and was giving instructions with a precision I had long come to recognize as a harbinger of the coming storm. We gathered in the parlour of the inn shortly after midday. Miss Penrose, pale but composed, and Inspector Venn, who had arrived without invitation, but with a grudging willingness to listen now that Carrick was dead and Braden had vanished. "I believe," Holmes began, "that an attempt to signal the coast will be made tonight, at high tide and under the cover of fog. The pattern, as recorded by Grimshaw and confirmed by Carrick, is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence." Venn folded his arms. "And your plan, Mr. Holmes?" "To use their own method against them," Holmes replied. "The lamp atop the tower is fitted with a series of shutters. Standard design, but with slight modification. It can function as a code beacon. I intend to intercept their signal and respond in kind." Miss Penrose's voice was quiet. "You mean to lure them in?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "We cannot match their secrecy, but we can exploit their confidence. Whoever they are, they believe the lighthouse is still theirs. That illusion must be allowed to stand for one more night." Venn looked unconvinced. "You'll be risking lives, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned to him sharply. "They have already taken 2, Inspector. If we hesitate further, it will be more. Grimshaw's death was no solitary crime. It was the opening move in a larger game, one we must now end." That evening, as the wind picked up and the light took on its familiar rhythm, Holmes and I ascended the tower one final time. He worked quickly with a set of brass tools, adjusting the timing gear and modifying the shutters. "Watson," he said without looking up, "tonight we answer their call. Let us see who dares respond." By the time twilight had faded into night, the fog had rolled in from the sea, thick, pale, and restless, like a living thing crawling inland from some unknown abyss. The village below vanished beneath its weight, and even the sea's endless murmur seemed to muffle itself, as if the very world were holding its breath. Holmes stood by the great lamp at the summit of the tower, eyes narrowed against the gloom. The mechanism had been rewired to allow manual override, and he adjusted it with delicate precision. "It is almost poetic," he murmured. "The very beacon once used for guidance, now repurposed to deceive its deceivers." Below us, the cliff edge had vanished into the white abyss, and only the sound of distant waves gave any sense of the world beyond. Miss Penrose remained in the room below, resolute despite Holmes's warning that what was to come might involve danger. Inspector Venn had positioned 2 officers at strategic points along the cliff, though Holmes had little confidence they would see anything through the mist. As the hour approached, Holmes grew silent. He checked his pocket watch, then the horizon. I joined him at the glass, straining my eyes into the void. "You're certain they'll come?" I asked. "They will," he replied, his voice low. "The tide is high, the signal path is clear, and they believe Braden has secured their secrecy. They think the trap remains untripped." He paused, then said quietly, "But tonight, Watson, the trap is ours." A silence followed, long, expectant, until Holmes, with sudden resolve, stepped back from the lens and took hold of the lever. "Now," he said, "let the serpent rise." At precisely midnight, a pale flicker danced upon the sea, a single point of light, far offshore, bobbing gently in the fog like a will-o'-the-wisp. Holmes did not move at first. He watched it with the careful attention of a chess master awaiting a familiar gambit. Then, without turning, he said softly, "There it is. 2 short, 3 long, 1 short. The same signal from Grimshaw's journal. They are here." He took hold of the lamp's shutter lever and with surgical precision replicated the signal in kind. 2 quick flashes, followed by 3 lingering glows and 1 final blink. A long pause followed. Then, from the water, the lantern blinked once in reply. "They've taken the bait," Holmes said. "What now?" "We wait. Whoever they are, they will not dock openly. They will approach by the cove below the cliffs. If they believe the tower secure, one of them may even enter it. And if they do, then they shall find more than they bargained for. Another 5 minutes passed before we heard it. A dull scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, from somewhere within the lower stair. Holmes motioned me to silence and extinguish the secondary lantern. We stood in shadow, listening. The steps creaked again. Someone was climbing. Holmes whispered, "They would not send a subordinate to face the unknown. This is someone high in the circle." We drew back into the far corner of the chamber, just as the top stair groaned beneath a heavy tread. And then we saw him. A figure emerged from the mist, dagger glinting faintly in one hand. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the empty lantern room. "Braden," I whispered. Holmes nodded, barely audible. Come to finish what he began. What followed was swift. As Braden stepped fully into the room, Holmes sprang from the shadows, seizing his wrist. The blade clattered to the ground as I rushed forward to assist. Within moments, Braden was subdued, gasping and pale. "You fools," he hissed. "You've doomed yourselves. You don't know who you're dealing with." Holmes smiled coldly. "On the contrary, I know exactly who we're dealing with, and I believe it's time we told the others." It was not long after Holmes sent the return signal that I noticed a shift in his bearing, one subtle but unmistakable to those who knew him well. Though his posture remained poised and calm, his gaze had sharpened, fixed not upon the lantern, but upon the stairs behind us. "Watson," he said, barely above a whisper, "brace yourself. We are not alone." I turned instinctively, and it was then that I caught the faintest tremor of movement at the edge of the lantern room's spiral entrance. A shadow upon shadow, heavier than the fog. And then a gleam, the unmistakable glint of steel. "Stay back!" I cried, but Holmes had already pivoted to face the figure emerging from the gloom. Braden. He moved with surprising speed, dagger in hand, his face contorted with something more than malice, something desperate, almost wild. His breath came in short bursts, and the blade trembled slightly in his grip, though not from weakness. "You should not have come back," he hissed. "This place was never yours to uncover. It kept the world away for generations, and now you would burn it to the ground." Holmes held his position with remarkable composure. "You would murder again to preserve your illusion. You've already struck down one man and sent another to his death. Will it end with us?" Braden took a single step forward, the dagger raised. "You don't understand. You can't. The circle is not a name. It is a bond, eternal, binding." At that, he lunged. But Holmes, ever the master of timing, stepped aside, forcing Braden to overextend. The blade struck only empty air, and in that instant I sprang forward from behind, grasping Braden's wrist with both hands. He thrashed, cursing, but the moment of surprise had passed. Holmes closed the distance swiftly, wrenching the weapon from his grasp. It clattered to the floor. Braden collapsed against the wall, panting, defeated. Holmes, breath steady, looked down at him coldly. "You should have known, Mr. Braden, that secrets have a habit of rising, especially when they are buried beneath the light." The silence that followed Braden's capture was filled not with relief, but with the tremor of what we now knew must be unearthed. He had slumped against the far wall of the lamp room, his chest heaving, eyes darting with a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. And yet, as Holmes crouched beside him, I saw something change. Something in the man's expression that softened ever so slightly. "You've already lost," Holmes said quietly. "Not in this room, but in the one above you chose to desecrate." Braden gave a dry, broken laugh. "You don't understand," he muttered. It wasn't just me. Then tell us who it was, I urged. Tell us the truth. For Grimshaw, for Carrick. His hands twitched slightly. Whether in pain or remorse, I could not say. We called it the Serpent's Wake, he said at last. It was older than even the tower itself, descended from the old wreckers who used false lights to lure ships onto the rocks. When the trade died, the name endured, a circle of men, bound in secrecy. The lighthouse was the key. At night, it became a guide, not to safety, but to hidden coves where cargo could vanish and reappear. Holmes gave no reaction, but I saw the slight shift in his gaze, attentive, weighing. And Grimshaw? I asked. He was once one of you? Braden nodded. But something changed. He'd grown tired, old, frightened. He started reading those books, talking about guilt. He said he was going to speak to someone in London. He called it repentance. I called it betrayal. And Carrick? Holmes asked. I warned him, Braden said bitterly. But he started talking too, said he couldn't do it anymore. I had to stop him. Holmes's voice was low and grave. So you drowned him where he sat? Braden didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Then, almost as an afterthought, he muttered, The light was sacred, you see. We guarded it. It guarded us. Holmes stood. No, he said, you twisted it, and now it will reveal every last shadow you tried to hide. It was in the stark light of Braden's confession that the truth at last fell into place, like stones aligning in a ruin long buried beneath the sand. With the danger subdued, Holmes requested that Braden be watched by Inspector Venn's men while he and I descended the winding stair. He will tell more before morning, Holmes said, but the essence is now clear. As we reached the landing where Grimshaw had met his end, Holmes paused, resting one hand lightly against the iron balustrade. This is where it happened, he murmured. Here, and not by accident. I followed his gaze to the outer edge of the stair, where the loose rung still bore the faint marks of manipulation. Holmes crouched to examine the base. It was no misstep, he said. It was theatre. Braden lured Grimshaw here under the pretense of reconciliation or warning. They climbed together, and at the precise moment when the lamp above flickered, whether by natural cause or design, Braden struck. He rose slowly. The light masked the murder. It became both weapon and witness. And what of Grimshaw's guilt, I asked, if he was once part of it? Holmes looked thoughtful. Guilt is a strange companion, Watson. It may slumber for years, then stir with terrible clarity. Grimshaw, I believe, sought to atone. His journal was no paranoid rambling. It was a record of awakening. He planned to expose the circle, and with it, sever a chain of crimes that stretched back a century or more. And that made him dangerous. Indeed, more dangerous than silence. Braden feared that one man's redemption would bring the whole order to ruin. Holmes turned to me. And it would have, had Miss Penrose not come when she did. We stood for a moment in silence. Then Holmes added, Let us return. There remains one final matter, an explanation to those who deserve the truth and a reckoning for those who sought to bury it beneath the sea. And with that, the final coil of the serpent began to loosen. The light would shine again, this time not as a veil for the wicked, but as the instrument of their undoing. It was within the lantern chamber, still tinged with the scent of salt and oil, that Holmes brought all parties together as dawn began to break across the horizon. The fog had lifted in the night, and the light, now restored to its rightful rhythm, shone over the sea not as a signal of secrecy, but of closure. Miss Penrose stood near the stairwell, her expression tight with emotion. while Inspector Venn, now far more deferential than before, leaned against the frame with arms crossed, his eyes flicking toward Braden, who sat bound and silent near the parapet. Holmes, ever composed, stepped into the centre of the room and began to speak, not as one might to peers, but as a professor might to his students, methodical and precise. "Let us begin with what we knew," he said. "Grimshaw, a solitary lighthouse keeper, is found dead at the base of this very staircase. Officially deemed an accident. Yet anomalies abound. An unsteady rung, a flickering light, and above all, a symbol carved near the lamp." He gestured slightly toward the wood panel still bearing the mark. "This symbol," he continued, "proved our first true lead, one tied to a circle of men known as the Serpent's Wake, whose operations date back over a century. Their purpose, smuggling. Their method, manipulating coastal lights to draw ships off course, then hiding the goods in coves known only to a few." Miss Penrose whispered. "Grimshaw discovered them." "Indeed," Holmes nodded. He had once been among them, but time, or perhaps conscience, compelled him to step away. He began documenting their codes, their meetings, their signals. He planned to send word to London, to dismantle the circle once and for all. Venn interjected, "And Braden?" "A loyalist," Holmes replied. "One who saw Grimshaw's turn as betrayal. On the night in question, under the flicker of a manipulated light, Braden ascended with Grimshaw, feigned concern, and delivered the fatal push." He turned slowly toward the bound man. Carrick was next, another wavering soul, and now, with their web exposed, we see the pattern. Fear cloaked in fog, violence masked by silence. Holmes's voice lowered, but fog disperses, and light, true light, cannot be hidden forever. After a pause, Holmes knelt beside the base of the lamp and produced one of the small brass tokens we had discovered earlier in Grimshaw's quarters. He held it between forefinger and thumb, examining the serpentine design etched into its surface. "The serpent devouring its own tail," he said softly. "An ancient image, older than the circle itself, known in some traditions as the Ouroboros, eternity, self-containment, but also secrecy, a loop that binds itself shut." Miss Penrose looked on with visible unease. "They used it as a mark?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, this symbol was no idle carving. It was an emblem, perhaps even a seal. Each member of the Serpent's Wake carried one of these tokens: brass for the footmen, silver for those higher in rank. Grimshaw's journals mention it obliquely, but the tokens confirm what he dared not write plainly." I leaned closer to examine it myself. "And the carving near the lamp room?" "An invocation, if you will," Holmes replied. "A claim of ownership. Just as lighthouses bear plaques of the crown, this one, in their eyes, bore the mark of their allegiance." Inspector Venn crossed his arms. "And what of the light itself?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "It was corrupted, used as a tool in their signalling system. A blink here, a delay there, all part of an elaborate language known only to the initiated. Ships would follow the false pattern to coves known to the circle alone." He turned to Braden. "And if any lightkeeper grew uneasy, well, then the fog provided its own justice." Braden said nothing. Miss Penrose's voice trembled slightly. "And Grimshaw, he had once stood among them." "Yes," Holmes answered. "But men are not stones, Miss Penrose. They may shift. And when they do, especially in secret societies, the ground beneath them often turns treacherous." He dropped the token into a pouch, his eyes never leaving Braden. "But this particular circle," he added, "has now been broken." As the morning sun broke faintly through the dissipating mist, Holmes removed the last remaining object from his satchel, Grimshaw's weathered journal. The leather binding had frayed at the corners, and many of its pages were damp and creased. But Holmes handled it with the delicacy of a surgeon holding a man's final testament. "This," he said, "was not merely the rambling of a haunted mind. It is, in fact, a ledger, coded, yes, but deliberate. A record of meetings, shipments, signal patterns, and, most importantly, intent." He turned to a page toward the end, where uneven lines hinted at a nervous hand. "Here is where Grimshaw committed to action. He planned to send this book to London. He believed Scotland Yard would understand its significance, and in doing so, bring down the wake." Miss Penrose looked upon it as if it were a sacred text. "He wanted to stop them." Holmes nodded. "He was once among them, yes. But time, combined with guilt, drove him to defiance. These entries are not only an exposure of the wake's operations, but a confession of sorts. He details his role in guiding ships to ruin in his early years. But then the tone changes. He speaks of omens, of dreams, of a light flickering with judgment. "And you cracked the code?" I asked. "Quite so," said Holmes. "The cipher relied on alternating stanzas from an old Cornish hymn, a fitting veil for crimes hidden behind local law. Once decoded, the entries revealed precise dates and times, and the final warning: if the moon is high and they answer still, then it is not chance, but ceremony." He closed the book and handed it to Inspector Venn. "This, Inspector, is all the evidence you will require. The rest lies in the cove, beneath the rock ledge east of the headland." Braden gave a bitter groan, but said nothing. Holmes turned next to the matter of Tobias Carrick, whose death had, until then, seemed the most inexplicable of all. Carrick, he said, posed a unique problem to the wake. He had grown fearful, too fearful to act, but too honourable to remain complicit. They feared he might confess. Inspector Venn frowned. "But there were no marks on his body, only seawater in his lungs." "Exactly," Holmes replied. "Which is why I examined the dock beneath his mooring. There, hidden in a maintenance alcove, I found a crude but effective bellows pump. Such a device could have been used to drown a man, artificially, while seated, ensuring no external trauma. A death that mimicked the sea's own hand." Miss Penrose gasped. "They staged the scene carefully," Holmes said, "and in doing so, sent a message to the others in the circle. Disloyalty would not be tolerated. Even the tide could be tamed into an executioner." Inspector Venn nodded grimly. "Then we have murder on 2 counts, and conspiracy on far more." "And the evidence to prove it," Holmes replied. "The serpent need not strike again. Its fangs are now removed." As the weight of the truth settled upon the room, Holmes turned to Miss Penrose with an expression of rare warmth. "You, madam," he said, "have shown remarkable composure. It was your courage that brought this matter to light, and your refusal to dismiss what others deemed superstition that ensured we arrived before more blood was spilled." She gave a humble nod, her eyes damp but steady. "I only did what conscience demanded, Mr. Holmes." "That," said Holmes, "is often what justice demands too." Inspector Venn stepped forward, doffing his cap with a sober expression. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I misjudged the matter at the start, and I misjudged you. Had you not pursued it, I fear this circle would have continued its work unchecked. You have my thanks, and the gratitude of the coast." Holmes inclined his head. "See to it that every member is named and tried, Inspector. This cult fed not merely on greed, but on fear. It is a darkness best purged at its roots." "And it shall be," Venn replied. "You have my word." Later that day, as we stood once more upon the cliffs, I found myself overcome by a strange melancholy. The sea had resumed its eternal rhythm, and the lighthouse now blinked in solemn intervals, its glow no longer a cipher, but a beacon reclaimed. "Holmes," I said quietly, "this case, it was different." He did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed upon the brass serpent coin he turned slowly between his fingers. "There was something ancient in it," I continued. "Not merely the crime, but the place itself. This headland, so isolated, so watchful, seemed almost alive." Holmes finally spoke. "The mind, Watson, when left too long in solitude, can breed shadows, some of them imagined, others inherited." I looked out across the endless grey. "It chills me," I said, "to think how easily such evil disguised itself, in routine, in superstition, in silence." He slipped the coin into his pocket. "And yet," he murmured, "the light endured." We stood there a while longer, not speaking, while gulls circled the tower and the mist drew back like a retreating tide. The circle had fallen, the signal had been broken, and in its place remained something quieter, but far more powerful. Truth. As we turned to leave, Holmes cast one last glance at the tower, its silhouette tall and still against the sky. "The lighthouse once guided ships through peril," he murmured. "And now it has done so once more, this time through darkness of a different kind." I said nothing. There was nothing more to say. For in that quiet moment, high above the cliffs of St. Treven's Head, the wind carried away the last trace of the serpent's whisper, and the light, at last, belonged only to the sea. As we descended from the lighthouse for the final time, the wind tugging faintly at our coats and the sea murmuring its eternal chorus below, Holmes paused at the edge of the cliff and looked out across the dim horizon. For a long moment he was silent. Then, in a voice low but firm, he said, "Curious, is it not, Watson, how a light intended to save lives can, in the wrong hands, become a weapon of silence?" I looked at him, the full weight of the case still heavy in my chest. Grimshaw sought to redeem himself, but in doing so, he illuminated everything they had tried to keep hidden. Holmes nodded slowly. "Guilt is a lantern, my dear Watson. It may flicker, it may falter, but when it is finally turned upon the darkness, it blinds the deceivers." We walked on, the cliffs behind us fading into the mist, and the lighthouse, once a symbol of secrecy, now standing tall, unburdened. But tell me, dear listener, what do you believe was the criminal's greatest misstep? Was it Braden's failure to destroy the journal, his blind loyalty to the cult? Or was it perhaps the underestimation of a man like Grimshaw, who, in silence, chose truth over fear? Share your theory in the comments below. Holmes would no doubt be delighted to see your deductions. And if you enjoyed unravelling this mystery beside us, don't forget to subscribe for more unsolved tales from the casebook of Sherlock Holmes. Share this story with fellow mystery lovers, and let the light of reason guide them too. Until the next case, keep your mind sharp and your lantern lit.